Good afternoon, students. Today is Tuesday, 27 April 2021. This will be our first lecture on Chapter 10, which is entitled Ross's Formalism. Now, formalism is a synonym for deontology. I taught you that earlier in the course. Deontology is a non-consequentialist moral theory. It comes from the Greek word deon, which means duty. Now, Kant was a deontologist, but so is David Ross. Their theories are not identical. Just because both of them think that duty is the main concept of ethics doesn't mean that they have the same theory. So we're going to look at another kind of deontology besides that of Kant. Now, we have 3 days remaining in the semester, and today's the first of those 3 days, and we're going to spend all 3 of them on this chapter by David Ross. And the exam is 2 weeks from today, on the 11th of May. And I've been telling you about that every time we meet on this video. I have posted a couple of handouts for you. One of them is the chapter of the book that we're going to be discussing today. I brought my copy of the book in. You can see it's not that thick. The book is entitled The Right and the Good. It's by a philosopher named William David Ross, and he tended to publish with his initials, W.D. Ross. And I posted chapter 1 of this book on Canvas. Someone has put it up on the internet, so all I had to do is put up the link. Now, you're not required to read this chapter by Ross. I hope you do. I hope you at least read some of it, if not all of it. But I won't draw any questions directly from the book, unless, of course, I lecture on them today or the following 2 lecture periods. I think we're going to cover only the first of 3 sections from Chapter 10. Now, I know on the reading list I had all 3 sections listed, but I think I can focus just on the first section, and it will take all 3 class periods. So here's how we're going to divide things up. You will see in a few minutes that Ross believes there are 7 duties. He calls them prima facie duties. And there are 7 of them. I think today I'm going to introduce Ross's theory and discuss the first of the 7 duties. And then when we meet again later this week, probably Friday, when we meet again, we'll discuss duties 2 through 4. And next week, for the final lecture period, we'll discuss the remaining 3 duties, 5 through 7. So by the time we're done, we will have covered all 7 of Ross's duties, and you'll understand his theory much better by then. So let me get started. I'll tell you a little bit about Ross. Ross was born in Thurso, Scotland in 1877, about 144 years ago. He lived a long life. He died in 1971 in Oxford, England. He's one of the great Scottish philosophers. Although, having been born in Scotland to Scottish parents, his family moved, I believe it was to India when he was a boy, and later they moved back to England. So he grew up in England, he was educated in England, and he lived in England. But he was Scottish. He was married to the same woman for 47 years, and they had 4 daughters. Now, Ross was a prolific author and editor. He knew Greek well enough to translate the works of Aristotle. So he's considered one of the great philosophical translators of all time. He also wrote about Aristotle. He wrote books and articles about Aristotle. He wrote books of his own on people like Kant and Aristotle, of course, and Plato. And he did original work in normative ethics. This book that I held up is just one of his books in which he set out his own ethical theory. Now, of course, his own ethical theory draws upon the work of others, such as Kant and Plato and Aristotle. Very few people come up with a new theory that is original and that is a clean break with the past. Most people tinker with the theories that have come down to them and improve them or modify them. And that's what Ross did. Ross, as I mentioned, is a translator of Aristotle. He translated and edited Aristotle's Physics. He translated Aristotle's Parva Naturalia, which is a book of natural philosophy or biology, and wrote a book entitled The Development of Aristotle's Thought. So that's just a few of the many books that Ross produced. He also worked during the war, during World War I, and I believe in World War II as well. He served on various governmental committees. And people who served on those committees said that he was a very judicious committee chair. He sifted through the evidence carefully, and he and the committee issued reports on various aspects of the war effort. One of them, as I recall, was on ordnance or munitions. So he served his country well during its two wars in the 20th century. And how he found time to do that kind of work, in addition to teaching and writing philosophy, is astounding, really. Okay, let's take a look at Ross's theory. Now, when Ross came of age, there were two great theories contending with one another: utilitarianism, which you now have studied, and Kantianism. And those are very different theories. What they have in common, though, is that in both cases, Kant and the utilitarians, they tried to find one thing, one property that distinguishes right acts from wrong acts. For the utilitarian, that property is maximization of the good, or we could say utility. So for a utilitarian, what makes an act right or wrong is simply that it produces the greatest amount of utility available to the agent at that time. So utilitarianism is a monistic theory. It says there's just one thing that makes an act right or wrong. And Kant agreed with that. In Kant's view, what makes an act right or wrong is whether it's universalizable. If you can consistently will that the generalized form of the maxim of your act be a universal law of nature, in other words, if you can universalize the maxim, then the act is right. And if you can't universalize the maxim, then the act is wrong. So we can say that in spite of their profound differences, utilitarians and Kantians share one thing. They're both monists about the right. They both believe that there's just one characteristic that makes acts right or wrong. Of course, they differ on what that characteristic is, but they do believe there's just one. Now, Ross thinks that both of those theories are misguided. Both of them are simplistic in his view. Ross thinks that there is more than one duty, and that in order to determine what's right or wrong, you have to weigh and assess those duties. Specifically, Ross says there are 7 duties. He calls them prima facie duties. So in a given situation, there can be more than one duty that applies. For example, and I think we'll just read a little bit from Feldman on page 150. Feldman gives a nice example of how you can have conflicting duties. So here we go. Page 150. Feldman writes, "It may be a bit unclear what Ross means when he says that an act is a prima facie duty. Perhaps the meaning of this term can be clarified by means of an example. So here we go. Suppose all we know about some proposed act is that if it were performed, it would be a case of promise keeping. That is, someone has made a promise to someone else, and if he were to perform this act, it would be the keeping of that promise. Even if we know nothing else about the act, we may still be inclined to say that there's at least one moral reason in favor of performing it. Because it would be an act of promise keeping, it would seem to have at least one right-making characteristic. Another way to put this point would be to say, following Ross, that the act in question is a prima facie duty. So you'll see in a few minutes when we start to look at the duties that Ross believes that it's always a good reason to keep a promise. that there is a prima facie duty to keep whatever promises you have made. Now, that doesn't mean you always must keep your promises, because you may have a conflicting duty that tells you not to keep your promise. So let's look at an example. The next paragraph, Feldman brings a conflict into play. Maybe this is a better illustration. Two prima facie duties conflict. Suppose, to continue the example, that the person who made the promise in fact promised to murder some innocent victim. So now we know the content of the promise that was made. It may be foolish, I'm sure you're thinking that, but in fact, the person promised to murder someone. It was a solemn promise to murder. In this case, Feldman says, as should be obvious, to keep the promise would be to murder the victim. Ross would say that the act of keeping the promise is nevertheless a prima facie duty. There's still at least one good moral reason in favor of performing it. It would be a case of promise keeping. On the other hand, there are some pretty good reasons for refraining from doing the act. For one, the performing of the act would result in severe injury to the innocent victim. So here we have an example that Feldman came up with based upon what Ross has written. In this example, the person in question has a duty, a prima facie duty, both to keep the promise and not to keep the promise. That's what I mean when I say that these duties are conflicting. One duty points you in the direction of performing the act. The other duty points you in the direction of not performing the act. Now, obviously, you cannot both perform the act and not perform the act. You can do one or the other, but you cannot do both. So what should you do? At this point, Ross says you have to use judgment. You have to determine which of the two duties is the strongest or weightiest in these circumstances. Now, pretty clearly, I hope you agree with me that in that situation, the duty to avoid killing someone or to refrain from killing someone is a stronger duty than the duty to keep your promise. The promise should never have been made. Given that it was made, you have a duty to keep it, but it's only a prima facie duty, and that means it's a conditional duty. It's a duty that you must fulfill on the condition that no more weighty or stronger duty conflicts with it. So for Ross, there are two concepts, prima facie duty and duty proper. That's what he calls it, duty proper. Or perhaps we could call it duty all things considered. So let's go back to Feldman's example, because it nicely illustrates the basic structure of Ross's theory. In Feldman's example, we have two duties, two prima facie duties. One of them is to keep the promise, which is the promise to murder someone. But there's also a prima facie duty to avoid harming people, and killing someone is a harm. So we have a conflict. Which duty is our duty, all things considered? That depends on how weighty or how strong the two duties are in this situation. And for that, you have to use judgment, Ross says. There's no calculus like Bentham came up with to weigh and quantify these duties. It's a matter of judgment. Now, I should tell you, some people don't like the fact that judgment enters into this. For Bentham, there was no place for judgment. It was a mechanical procedure, remember? You simply identified the individuals who are affected by each act that you can perform on that occasion. You then determine how those individuals would be affected by performing each act. You assign a measure or a numeral to each of those quantities, either hedons or dolors, depending on whether the act makes the person happier or less happy. And then you simply add things up. It's a purely mechanical procedure, Bentham's felicific calculus. Okay? There's no room for judgment in there. And that's the way Bentham meant for it to be. Ross thinks that that's a mistake. Ross thinks that judgment is inescapable in ethics. As we live our moral lives day in and day out, we're called upon to exercise judgment. We have to make judgments about which of our duties is strongest in particular situations. And that leaves open the possibility that two people in the same situation facing the same conflict might assign different weights or strengths to the two duties. And if they do assign different weights or strengths, then they might arrive at different conclusions about which duty is the duty proper. That is, the duty all things considered. And Ross would say that's quite possible. That can happen. Reasonable, intelligent, well-meaning people sometimes disagree about what their moral duty is, all things considered. And we have to live with that. That's part of that's part of life. And to try to get rid of that kind of judgment so that everyone agrees with what the right action is, that's hopeless. We might hope for it, but it's never going to produce unanimity. Okay, so Ross wants to create a realistic, real-world moral theory that doesn't require a calculation the way Bentham's does, that allows room for disagreement among people who are reasonable and intelligent. That's simply what we have to live with. Now, you might think that Ross's theory says, do whatever seems right to you. It does not say that at all, right? Ross is not saying just do whatever you think your duty is on this occasion. Ross insists that there are 7 duties, not 8, not 9, not 6, not 5, 7. And you should always consult all 7 duties at every moment of your life. In fact, the number is so small that you could remember them quite easily and teach them to your children. In fact, most parents probably do already teach these duties to their children. They say, keep your promises, tell the truth. If someone helps you in some way, show gratitude by saying thank you or something else. If you've wronged somebody, you've got to make amends. You've got to say, I'm sorry, and maybe more. You should avoid harming people in various ways. You should do good. Do as much good as you can. You should see to it that people get what they deserve. And finally, you should work on your own moral character. You should improve yourself. You can see he got that one from Kant. So Ross says that there are 7 things you should always keep at the forefront of your mind in terms of determining what you should do morally. And 7 is a manageable number. I heard long ago that human beings can easily remember 7 digits, but 8 becomes more difficult, 9 even more difficult. And that's why phone numbers have 7 digits, I think. Right? First of all, that's enough digits to give us enough numbers for everybody. But secondly, people can remember a 7-digit phone number. Just ask yourself, how many 7-digit phone numbers do you remember besides your own? Probably quite a few. Probably at least half a dozen phone numbers you remember. Your parents, your spouse, children, a friend or two, and so on. So Ross has given us what he considers a manageable number of prima facie duties, and his advice is always bring these 7 duties to bear in every situation you find yourself in. And if you find yourself in a situation where 2 or more of these 7 duties conflict with one another, pointing you in different directions, then you have to assign weight or strength to those duties to determine what your duty proper is, your duty, all things considered. You can think of these prima facie duties, if you want, as moral reasons. So to have a prima facie duty to do act X is just to have a moral reason to do X. Not a prudential reason or a self-interested reason, but a moral reason. What Ross is saying is you always have a moral reason to keep your promises, whatever the promise may be, even if it's a promise to murder someone. He might wag his finger and say, that was stupid, by the way. You should never have promised to murder someone, because that's going to create a conflict. When the time comes to keep the promise, you're going to have to make a decision between keeping your promise and refraining from harming someone by murdering him or her. So try to avoid putting yourself in conflict situations. But if you do find yourself in a situation of conflict, then you have to exercise judgment. That's all a reasonable, rational person can do. So, some people are attracted to Ross's theory, and maybe you're one of them, as I've explained it so far, and based upon your reading of Feldman. Maybe you're attracted to it. Maybe you think this is the right approach. Maybe, on the other hand, you dislike it already. Maybe you're repulsed by it. Maybe you think that it allows too much judgment. People can rig it in such a way to get whatever result they want. But keep in mind that if you're determined to rig a system or a theory, you can do that with any theory. You could rig Bentham's theory, utilitarianism. How can you rig it? You can conveniently ignore someone who is affected by your action, or you can give someone's interest greater weight than others, which is prohibited by Bentham, or you could exaggerate the amount of hedons or dolors that someone will experience as a result of your action. So if you're dishonest, if you're determined to get a certain result using a particular theory, you'll be able to do so. If you're determined to get a particular result using Kant's theory, you can do so. Remember the case of Miss Perkins discussed by Feldman in chapter 8? Miss Perkins wanted to purchase a term paper and turn it in as her own work. So she rigged up a maxim that could be universalized, that she could consistently will to be a universal law. And that allowed her to conclude that the act of buying and turning in a term paper was right. So Feldman has already illustrated how you can abuse Kant's theory. And my point right now is, whatever theory you have on the table, whether it's egoism, utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, Kantianism, or Ross's theory, which I call Ross's pluralism, any theory can be abused if someone is dishonest. What Ross would say is, if you are conscientious and honest, you can get some real advice from following his theory. Right? Keep these 7 duties in mind, weight them appropriately when they conflict, and then do whichever act has the greatest weight of prima facie duties behind it. Okay, so that's the gist of Ross's theory. Right? He makes use of this concept, prima facie duty. You may be wondering what the term prima facie duty means. Well, the words prima and facie are Latin. Prima means first, as in primary. Right? Primary means the first, as opposed to secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and so on. Facie means face, which gives us words like facade. So literally, prima facie means first face, or better, at first blush, at first appearance. So when Ross describes these duties as prima facie duties, it might be thought that he's saying these are duties at first blush or at first appearance. And that seems to be what he's suggesting. These are duties, but they may not end up being our duty, all things considered. That depends on whether there are other duties that come into play that outweigh it. If not, then the prima facie duty would be our duty proper. If there are other duties that come into play, and if they outweigh this first prima facie duty, then the first prima facie duty would not be our duty proper. The other one would. So prima facie duty for Ross means something like duty unless some other more stringent duty outweighs it or is stronger than it. Stringent means stronger, and it's a term Ross uses quite often, stringent duties. Okay, you with me? So Ross believes that we must exercise judgment. Now, is Ross wedded to there being just 7 prima facie duties? He says no. He says, I've thought about it a great deal. Maybe initially he thought there were 8 duties, and then he realized one of them can be dispensed with. Maybe one of the 8 can be included within one of the other 7. So Ross is not wedded to there being 7. There could end up being 8 or 9. There could be maybe 6 or 5. But Ross said, my best judgment is that there are 7 prima facie duties. Now, someone might criticize Ross and say that he missed a duty and that there are really 8. Could Ross accept that? Possibly. Ross would be open to being persuaded that he neglected a prima facie duty, which would bring the total up to 8. He might also be persuaded that one of his 7 is not really a prima facie duty, or perhaps that it can be included in one of the other 6, reducing the number to 6. So don't confuse the framework of Ross's theory with the actual number of duties, right? It wouldn't destroy Ross's theory to change the number of prima facie duties to 8 or 6, right? You would use the theory in the same way. The theory would work the same way, whether it has 6 prima facie duties, 7, 8, or any other number. So we're going to look at the 7 duties that Ross thinks there are, the 7 prima facie duties. And I'll give you some conflicts along the way. Once we have discussed the various theories, we can start to think up conflicts. And I'll ask you how you might resolve those conflicts. Okay, so let's turn to one of the things I posted on Canvas. What I've done is I've excerpted a particular passage from Ross's book. Once again, this is my copy of Ross's book published in 1930. It's entitled The Right and the Good. And chapter 2 of this book is entitled What Makes Right Acts Right? And that's really the question of normative ethics in general, isn't it? What is it exactly that makes right acts right and wrong acts wrong? That's a philosophical question, which is why philosophers have tried to answer it. Now, Bentham had his own answer. He says what makes right acts right is that they maximize overall happiness. Kant differs. Kant says what makes right acts right is that they are universalizable. And now Ross comes along and says, no, I have a different idea of what makes right acts right. What makes right acts right is whether they're in accordance with our duty, all things considered. And to figure that out, we need to know what the prima facie duties are. And there are 7 of them, he says. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to read exactly what Ross said for each of the 7 duties, and then I'm going to discuss it with you. And I have plenty of examples to help you understand the nature of each of these duties. So let me begin with a very short introductory paragraph provided by Ross. Here's what he says. He says, there's nothing arbitrary about these prima facie duties. Each rests on a definite circumstance which cannot seriously be held to be without moral significance. Of prima facie duties, I suggest, without claiming completeness or finality for it, the following division. So there he's saying explicitly, I'm not claiming that this is a complete list. Maybe I'm wrong and there are 8 or more. And he's not saying this is final. This is his thinking at the time the book was published. But it represents a great many years of thought, of deep thought. I can tell you that by 1939, when his next book came out, a much bigger book entitled Foundations of Ethics, Ross, in that decade in which this book had been widely criticized by his fellow philosophers, Ross still held the view that there are 7 prima facie duties. In other words, in the face of an onslaught of criticism, he was not persuaded to either increase or decrease the number of prima facie duties. He continued to believe that there are 7. Okay, so let's take a look at the basic structure. Now, I've been telling you all along that there are 7 prima facie duties, and there are. But Ross numbers them as follows. He numbers them 1A, 1B, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right? So how many is that altogether? It's 7 duties. But he thinks that the first 2 duties can be thought of as sub-duties of the main duty. Okay, so 1A and 1B are separate duties, but he lumps them together under one heading. So I'm going to continue to say that there are 7 duties. I could have said there are 6 duties, and the first one is divided into 2 others. But I think it's probably more easier to understand if we just say there are 7 duties. Okay, well, let's begin. I told you that I'm going to cover the first duty today, and then when we meet again later this week, we'll cover duties 2 through 4, and then next week when we wrap things up, we'll do 5 through 7. And I've collected a lot of examples over the years to elaborate on these duties, illustrate them, and so on. I hope you find them interesting, and I hope each of them provides you with some food for thought that you can use in the rest of your life, long after this course is over. Okay, let's begin. I'm going to read first what Ross says, and then I'm going to turn the handout over because on the back, I have provided what I call pithy formulations of the 7 duties. I give them names taken from Ross, and I give a pithy, which means short and crisp, to the point, pithy. I'm going to give you a pithy formulation, one that you could remember, one that you could teach your children to remember. Okay, so let's begin with Ross. Ross says, some duties rest on previous acts of my own. These duties seem to include 2 kinds. And then, here's where he subdivides them, A and B. A, those resting on a promise, or what may fairly be called an implicit promise, such as the implicit undertaking not to tell lies, which seems to be implied in the act of entering into conversation, at any rate by civilized men, or of writing books that purport to be history and not fiction. These may be called the duties of fidelity. Now, immediately after the word fidelity, you see the letter B. That means he's going to start discussing the second of the 7 duties, and we're going to do that next time. So I'm going to stop reading Ross. Let me comment on it before we go to some examples and illustrations. This duty, like the second one, he says, rests on a previous act of my own. What he means by that is that people have this duty, the duty of fidelity, only because they've already done something. And it was the doing of that something that created the duty. Interesting, isn't it? You create the duty, the moral duty that you have. Now that implies that if you never make a promise, you never have a duty of fidelity, right? The duty of fidelity is the keeping of the promise you made. If you didn't make a promise, then you haven't generated or created a duty of fidelity, a duty to keep it. You're probably thinking, I know what you're thinking, gee, I can avoid this duty if I never make a promise. That's true, but are you really going to be able to do that? We make promises quite often. I was tempted to say every day, but maybe we don't make a promise every day, but very often we do. We promise our children that if they get their homework done, they'll get to play on the computer, or that if they're good, they'll be taken on a vacation this summer. We promise things to our spouses. I promise I'll take some time off work and we'll go out to eat, or whatever it may be. So we make promises routinely. It's a part of our lives. And what this first duty says is when you make a promise, however trivial it may be, you have now incurred a duty to keep it. And Ross calls that the duty of fidelity. Notice he also mentions something interesting. Promises, he uses the term implicit promise. What's the opposite of implicit? What does it contrast with? It contrasts with explicit. So what is Ross saying? He seems to be saying that promises are of two types. Some of them are explicit. We actually come right out and say, I promise. Or, well, we don't have to use particular words like I promise. We can articulate the promise. If someone says, do you promise to, if your child says, do you promise to take me to Disneyland this summer? And you say yes, or even nod your head, you're making an explicit promise, right? You don't have to say I promise or the words in French or German that correspond to those words. You don't have to say anything. Promises can be implicit as opposed to explicit. So what would an example of an implicit promise be? It would be, according to Ross, a promise not to tell lies. So Ross is saying that if you enter into conversation with someone, you are implicitly promising that person not to lie. So if I'm conversing with someone, and the person says, oh, by the way, what time is it? And I look at my watch, I could easily lie, and maybe I have a motive for lying. Maybe I'm trying to keep this person from attending a meeting, so I may lie and say the meeting, it's earlier than it really is. So the person will stay there and talk with me and miss the meeting. So that's a lie, right? I've said something that I believe to be false with the intention of deceiving someone. What Ross is saying is when you're conversing with others, you have a prima facie duty not to lie. And it's implicit in the conversation, right? Imagine if we had to explicitly promise not to tell lies. Two people come together to have a conversation. Each of them says to the other, before they even begin, I hereby promise not to lie in what's to come. And the other one says, and I too promise not to lie. That would be an explicit promise made by each of the two parties not to lie. Ross says we don't need to do that explicitly. Just entering into the conversation with the other person is promising not to tell a lie, right? Not to deceive someone by misrepresenting things. Now, he says, if you write a book, right? He says the writing of books that purport to be history and not fiction. So if you write a book and publish it, publish means put out there in the pub so that the public has access to it. If you publish a book that purports to be history, right? If you're writing a book on the Civil War, the American Civil War, for example, unless you call it a novel, if you put it out there as history, then you are committing yourself to telling the truth in that book, or the truth as you know it, the truth as you see it, the truth as you believe it. So merely publishing a book as a work of history is committing yourself, promising that what you say in it is true. You're committing yourself to the truth of what is said in that book. Now, you're not doing that if you publish a novel or a work of fiction. Okay? If you publish a book that does not purport to be history, you are not therefore committing yourself to the truth of what is said in it. So take a novel like Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Nobody who picked that up and looked at the cover or read the first few pages, nobody would think it's a work of history, that Jules Verne is recounting what happened in the past. Right? You would very quickly realize that it's a work of imagination, a work of fiction, that Jules Verne made it up. Now, he may have made up situations and people that are realistic, but unless he claimed that it's the truth or that it's factual, he is not committing himself to anything in that book being true. So publishing a work of history and publishing a work of fiction are very different, Ross would say. In the one, the work of history, you're committing yourself to the truth of what you say. In the work of fiction, you are not committing yourself to the truth of what you say. So in the case of the history book, you have a prima facie duty to speak the truth. We can call that the duty of veracity. Let me spell that for you. Veracity. I don't recall Ross using that word, but it's the commonly used word for truth-telling, veracity. So Ross is saying that the duty of fidelity includes a duty of veracity, a duty to tell the truth. At least if you're writing a work of history or if you're claiming to provide factual information to somebody. But if you're a stand-up comedian, if you're acting in a play or a movie, if you're writing a novel or any other kind of fiction, you do not have a duty of veracity in those situations. So whether you have a duty of veracity depends a lot on the circumstances, on what you're doing, what you purport to be doing. So writing a work of history does create a duty of fidelity, specifically the duty of veracity. Writing a work of fiction does not. All right? So no one could be blamed. Imagine somebody who's acted in a play being accosted at the conclusion of the play. Imagine someone in the audience saying, "You said during the play that Austin is the capital of Oklahoma, and that's not true." You would respond, I hope, by saying, "Look, it was a play. I was acting. I didn't assert it as a truth. It was all said in the context of a play, which is the work of imagination. Settle down," you would say to the audience members. Settle down. Now, you must not understand the distinction between making a factual claim and asserting something factual in the context of a dramatic production, a movie or a play or a novel or a work of fiction. Okay, let's turn the handout over. Now that we've read and discussed what Ross actually wrote, here is my pithy formulation of it. First of all, Ross used the word fidelity. In fact, he said, "These may be called the duties of fidelity." So I'm using his actual words. Now, the word fidelity, before we go any further, you'll see I have a footnote. The word fidelity, read footnote 2, it derives from the Latin word fides, Fides. And the word fides is usually translated into English as faith. Right? So the duty of fidelity means the duty to be faithful, or perhaps better, keep the faith. Keep the faith. So if you made a commitment to somebody, keeping faith means keeping the commitment. So my pithy formulation of Ross's duty of fidelity is simply be faithful. You see it there at the top of page 2 of my handout? Now I copied my handout on one sheet of paper, but it's 2 pages, so I'm looking at the second page now. Now let's elaborate on this. This duty of fidelity, I say here, includes 1, telling the truth, or at least not lying, and 2, keeping your commitments. Now, what are the commitments? What is a commitment, first of all, and what kinds of commitment are there? Well, here are some examples of commitments. First of all, promises. We've talked about that already. That may be the main type of commitment we make. We make promises to people. But also a vow. We make vows to people. We make resolutions. We resolve to do this or that. We make pledges. We take oaths. We make agreements with others. We enter into contracts with others. And we undertake engagements. Now you're probably thinking of an engagement that precedes marriage, or that typically precedes marriage, but there are other engagements. It's an old-fashioned word, I may engage someone to mow my lawn. So that's an engagement, right? It just means I've hired someone. I've entered into an agreement with someone to mow my lawn. Okay, so it includes the engagements that lead to marriage, but it also includes other forms of engagement when you engage a worker or hire a worker. So those are some examples of commitments. Now let me go back to my notes. Bear with me just for a moment. I have to flip through the pages in my notebook. I have some additional points I'd like to make about these various examples of commitments. Okay. By the way, the word fides, gives rise to lots of interesting words in English. Have you ever heard the word confidential? Right? Things that are said between you and your doctor, or you and your lawyer, or you and your accountant, or you and your minister or priest, those things are confidential. Notice, inside the word confidential is F-I-D-E, confidential. So confidential, the word confidential or the word confidence has faith in it. So when I talk to my attorney, what we say to one another is to be kept in good faith. That means we don't disclose what was said to anyone outside of that relationship unless we have permission to do so from the other person. So the word confidential comes from the Latin root fides, and you can see why. It's keeping faith with the one you're talking to. Other words are fiduciary, F-I-D, notice right at the beginning of the word. A fiduciary is someone who is entrusted with something valuable. And that person is said to have a fiduciary relationship with the owner of the property. So suppose I give some of my money to someone who knows how to invest it and earn a good return on that investment. The person who's handling my money is a fiduciary. That person is said to be in a fiduciary relationship with me. And you can see why we call it that. That person has to handle my money in good faith. Right? That person has to be faithful to me. I'm the owner of the money. That person's job is just to invest it so that I get the greatest return possible. Ever heard the term bona fide? A bona fide this or that? It means good faith. Bona means good. Fide means faith. So a bona fide such and such is a good faith such and such. Now the word bona fide sometimes means genuine, right? Like bona fide leather means genuine leather rather than some kind of faux or fake or counterfeit leather. But that's just a secondary use of the word, right? In fact, it's secondary, but you can see the connection. Calling it genuine leather means that it's faithful, right? There's no fakeness to it, no falsity to it, right? No misrepresentation. It's a faithful item. It's faithful to what it purports to be, leather. Okay, what about infidel? An infidel, I-N-F-I-D-E-L. Notice F-I-D-E is in that word. Infidel is someone who lacks the faith. So if you're religious, you are of a particular faith. Anyone outside of your religion you might consider an infidel, someone who lacks your faith. All right? Ever heard the term semper fidelis, or for short, semper fi? You may see it on a bumper sticker, semper fi. I've seen it. It's the slogan of the Marine Corps, and it means always faithful. Semper means always, and fidelis means faithful. Notice F-I-D. Always faithful. The Marines say we're always faithful. We never leave anyone behind. We're faithful to our country and to our flag and to our people. Ever heard the word perfidy or perfidious? P-E-R-F-I-D-Y, perfidy. P-E-R means thoroughly, and F-I-D means faithful. So a perfidious person is someone who breaks faith, who breaches faith. It's a kind of someone who's a traitor. A traitor is engaged in perfidious behavior, behavior that breaks faith with one's compatriots, for example. What about the term Fido? That's the standard term for a dog, isn't it? Fido, F-I-D. Dogs are supposedly faithful and loyal to their owners or masters. And there you go. So we needed a word that represents the faithfulness and loyalty of a dog. What better word than Fido? I don't know of any cats named Fido. Would that be appropriate for cats? You have to tell me. I'm a dog person. I don't know much about cats. I know that dogs are loyal and faithful, and the word Fido is appropriate for them, but maybe cats are not. Maybe cats are more aloof, less faithful to their owners, and I don't know. So Fido is the term for a dog. Also, there's a name, you may have heard of Fidel Castro, the former leader of Cuba, president, I think. Fidel must come from the Latin root word fide. So when his parents named him, maybe they gave him that name because they were devoutly religious and they expected him to be faithful as well. So it's a common name. You see it in Latin America among Hispanics, Fidel. Okay, now let's talk about some of these commitments that I mentioned before. Let's begin with promises. Just to repeat something I said earlier today, you can promise without using the words, I promise. Now, you can, if you want, be maximally explicit about your promise. You can say to your children, I hereby promise to take you to Disneyland this summer. Or perhaps it's a conditional promise. I hereby promise that if you get all A's and B's on your report card this spring, then I'll take you to Disneyland this summer. Okay, that's a conditional promise. It's still a promise, but there's a condition attached to it. It doesn't kick in other words, until that condition is satisfied, unless that condition is satisfied. So promises can be explicit or implicit. You don't actually have to use words at all to promise. I gave an example earlier where you just nodded your head. If a child says, Mom or Dad, do you promise to take us to Disneyland this summer? And the parent nodded in the affirmative, that's a promise. The child will certainly understand it that way. And you can use sign language. You can sign, I don't know the sign, but I'm sure there's a way of saying I promise in sign language. That's a valid promise, a binding promise. Now, what's a vow? A vow is a commitment, and as a commitment, it must be kept. I mean, there's a prima facie duty to keep your vows, according to Ross. Here is the traditional marriage vow. I got this from the online book of common prayer. Now, this is a very common wedding vow, matrimonial vow. There are variations on this theme, but here's what I found. In the name of God, I, and then you insert your name, take you, and then you insert the other person's name, to be my wife or husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until we are parted by death. This is my solemn vow. So, that's an example of a vow. Vows don't have to be matrimonial. You can vow to do anything or not to do anything. But a vow is a commitment. And once made, you have incurred or created in yourself a prima facie duty to keep it, Ross would say. So keep your promises and fulfill your vows, whether they're marital or otherwise. Now, these are prima facie duties, remember. That means in a particular case, there could be a greater duty telling you not to keep that duty. There could be another duty that conflicts with it, and that other duty could be even weightier than the original one, in which case you would perform the duty that has the greater weight. Also, something I haven't mentioned, it's conceivable that 3 or more prima facie duties could apply in the same situation. And if that ever were to happen, then once again, you've got to assign weight or strength to each of the duties, whether they're 3, 4, or however many. And once you've assigned them their weight, it will tell you what to do. In fact, if you want, you can think of a scale metaphor. So imagine that you've got a prima facie duty to keep a promise that you've made. Think of that as being on this side of the scale, so it gives some weight to that side. Now look at other duties that may point in the other direction. Suppose you've made a promise to murder someone. You have a prima facie duty, we'll see later, not to harm people, and murdering them is a grave harm. So that duty has to go on the other side of the scale, and you've got to assign it a certain amount of weight. Now, I would suggest to you, and I hope you agree with me, that prima facie duty weighs more than the other one. So it would be down here, right? This platter. So the point I'm making is initially the platters are like this on the scale. Put all the duties that apply in that situation on the scale, and that will tell you what the right thing to do is, all things considered. It will tell you what your duty proper is. Okay? Bring all the duties to bear, assign them their proper weights, and see where the balance lies. Whichever side of the scale weighs the most is your duty proper. So that's the system that Ross is advocating. Keep all 7 duties in mind, bring them to bear at any given moment when you're making a decision, and use your judgment in assigning weights or strengths, and then reach a result and perform that act. Okay, what is a resolution? We talk about New Year's resolutions. When you resolve, even if it's a New Year's resolution, resolve to lose weight or ride a certain number of miles on your bike, that's a commitment. It may be a commitment to yourself rather than to others, but it's still a commitment, and you are expected to keep it. In fact, won't you feel guilty if you make a resolution and fail to keep it? That guilt is the psychological manifestation, if you will, of the fact that that is a duty. You feel as though when you make a resolution, you are creating a duty. You are binding yourself. And if you fall short of what you resolve to do, you're going to feel guilty or remorseful about it. Now, you may not have to apologize to anyone because only you are involved, but you will feel pangs of guilt, I'm sure. I know I would if I had a goal of riding, let's say, 7,000 miles in a particular calendar year, and I fell short, even if it was by 100 or 200 miles, I would feel as though I let myself down. Right? I did not achieve my goal. I made a resolution and I failed to keep it. And I might redouble my efforts. I'll say, next year, by golly, I will get that 7,000 miles. I'll make sure I rack up enough miles early in the year so that if I get sick later on or we have bad weather, I'll still be able to get my 7,000 miles. So a resolution, even though it's self-interested, has a certain amount of weight to it, right? It creates a duty, a prima facie duty in yourself to keep it. What about a pledge? Suppose you pledge money to a public television station or to public radio. You're expected to keep that pledge. When you call in to make a pledge, they take your name and number and write down the amount that you're pledging. And at a certain point, they call in the pledge. They say, now is the time for you to pay up. Right? We didn't make you make a pledge, but you did. You voluntarily did. And you thereby created an obligation or duty in yourself to pay it. And now's the time to pay up. They'll try to be nice about it, but they want to be firm as well. Right? They want to remind you, you did make a commitment to us, and we expect you to keep it. And at a minimum, they will want you to feel guilty if you fail to comply or to keep your pledge. And they know that guilt is a motivator. So most people, to avoid feeling guilty, will do their duty. In this case, pay the money that they pledged to pay. Okay, an oath is a witness in a trial takes an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. People who hold public offices take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, for example, and maybe some other things as well. An oath is a commitment, and it creates in the person who makes that commitment a duty. It creates a prima facie duty. Any kind of agreement you make with anyone is a commitment. If you enter into a binding legal contract, you've undertaken a commitment. And again, if you've entered into an engagement with someone, it could be a marital engagement or some other kind of engagement. So our lives are filled with commitments, aren't they? Aren't they? Our lives are filled with commitments. And all Ross is saying is that we have a prima facie duty to keep whatever commitments we make. If you don't like having such a duty, don't make commitments. It's up to you whether you make a commitment. It's not up to you whether you keep your commitment. That is a matter of duty. It may be prima facie duty, and in a particular case, it might be outweighed by stronger duties or heavier duties, but it's still a prima facie duty. And that never goes away. Even if a particular duty is outweighed in a particular situation, that doesn't mean that the original duty never existed or had no weight. It always had weight. It just got outweighed by something more. Okay? Now, I've already talked about the fact that commitments can be explicit or implicit, and we've already talked about the fact that veracity is a subtype of fidelity. Telling the truth, or at least avoiding lying to people, is a commitment that we undertake when we enter into conversation or when we publish books that purport to be factual. Okay, let me end with the UTA honor code. Did you know that UTA, our university, has an honor code? It's on the UTA website somewhere, and I know that because I copied and pasted it into my syllabus a few years ago. I don't think I have it in my syllabus anymore. I just use the standard verbiage that's given to me by the university. But here is from an old syllabus of mine. Here is the UTA honor code, and it contains not only a pledge, but a promise. 2 commitments. Here they are. I pledge on my honor to uphold UTA's tradition of academic integrity, a tradition that values hard work and honest effort in the pursuit of academic excellence. So every student at UTA, by enrolling in this university, is understood to be making this pledge. And that's a commitment. And according to Ross, that would create a prima facie duty on your part to keep that pledge. The second paragraph is a promise. It says, I promise that I will submit only work that I personally create or contribute to group collaborations, and I will appropriately reference any work from other sources. I will follow the highest standards of integrity and uphold the spirit of the honor code. So that's an explicit promise. So every student, including you at UTA, is understood by the university to have agreed to those 2 paragraphs, to have made a pledge and a promise. The promise is not to commit what's called plagiarism. It's a pledge, it's a promise to do your own work and not to submit store-bought term papers like Miss Perkins from chapter 8. Okay? Now, maybe you weren't aware of that honor code, but now you are. And now it's even worse if you break that pledge or break that promise. It's even worse because you may have had an excuse previous to today. You may have had an excuse of ignorance. Gee, I didn't know that when I enrolled at UTA, I was pledging and promising to do these things, but now you know. So ignorance is no longer an excuse for you, if it ever was. The old saying is, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Someone might argue that ignorance of this pledge and this promise was never an excuse, because when you enroll, you are deemed to have read all of the relevant materials on the UTA website and to have agreed to them. Enrolling means I agree, I hereby agree to all of the conditions and requirements, including the honor code. So let me put it this way. You may or may not have had an excuse called ignorance, but now you clearly do not have such an excuse. So I hope you uphold the best traditions of UTA and keep your pledge, keep your promise in all of your coursework. If you're just a freshman, you've got a long way to go, several years. If you're a senior, you may almost be done, but you still have some exams and assignments, I'm sure. Okay, so take that pledge and promise seriously. It's part of what makes a university a great place. Right? We're bound together by these commitments that we make to one another. Okay, so just to review, we are going over the actual words Ross wrote because Feldman does not quote him at length, so I did for you on this handout. We're going over the 7 prima facie duties one by one, talking about each one as we go. Today we did the prima facie duty of fidelity, which has as one of its subcomponents the duty of veracity. On the back of this handout are my pithy formulations and other material that I've given you to elaborate on it. I've showed you the book by Ross. I'll probably keep bringing this up here when I lecture because I may quote from it here and there. And the other thing posted on Canvas is the actual chapter 2 from that book that's posted on the internet. And I recommend that you read it. I won't test you directly from the book, unless, of course, I quote from it, which we're doing here with this handout. Okay? So have a great day and a great tomorrow. I expect to give the second lecture for you this week on Friday. I have 2 meetings tomorrow, so I won't be doing any lectures. And I have to also lecture twice this week in my biomedical ethics course. So I have 4 lectures plus some meetings. And I'm getting started on Tuesday. So my lectures this week will be Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Your second lecture probably will be Friday. So until then, make sure you've read Feldman's first section of chapter 10 carefully and slowly. Make sure you've read over my handout before you watch my lecture. And if you can, read some or all of Ross's chapter 2. Okay, enough for today. See you next time.